Thank you so much for joining, everybody. Today we'll be talking in more advanced way about the ethics of artificial intelligence. Like you know, my name is Sufyan Aldugum, and I'm here like a graduate student here at Stanford. So today is a very interesting topic, and it will also explore a few ideas or a few areas within the ethics of artificial intelligence that, to be honest, are rarely discussed. And from my experience working as a software engineer and also my network of friends and other developers, a lot of people who are in the domain are actually expecting this to happen a lot faster than many of the general think. So I think this presentation is not only really interesting, but it's very important as well. And just heads up, some of the ideas that we'll be discussing here are a little bit of some people might think of it as a part of your imagination, but in reality, it's very real and it's going to happen very soon. So let's go ahead and start looking at the um, uh, outline. So yeah, here we have the main concept that we were talking about. We'll discuss a few, main AI discussion points in the near future. We'll talk about AI ethics challenges and AI safety. We'll talk about the moral status of AI. Number three, of course, this is a very new and interesting concept of thinking about the moral status of those machines themselves. Here, we're not talking about humans dealing with them. We're not talking about external stakeholders. We're actually talking about those machines themselves. And would they have a moral status? And if they do, would it be different than humans, etc. Number four, it's going to be an ethical assessment. We're going to be talking about, AI in the concept with respect to humans and compare those two. Then, of course, we're going to be talking about an interesting point of what's going to happen in the future with super intelligence and how would we develop ethical frameworks that govern those systems while they develop themselves. So let's go ahead and start with the introduction. Of course, like we discussed, the possibility of creating thinking machines raises a host of ethical issues. Of course, it should not harm other humans or other relevant beings, such as animals. The moral status of those machines themselves. So those are the ethical issues we have to think about when we develop thinking machines that can think and design and even design themselves. So those are the two things we have to think about. Of course, and then as we look at the system in general, we have to make sure look at how responsible it is, transparent, how do we audit it, and make sure there's no corruption involved, and if we can predict its outcome as well. So let's start with a few of the issues that may arise in the future. I picked two main points. There are many uh, discussion points, but I kind of picked the two more important ones, especially that we started kind of seeing them with our current implementation of AI. And so AI algorithms play an increasingly large role in modern society, though usually not labeled as AI. What I mean by that is that we do have a lot of subsystems that use AI, but the general whole of the software does not really consider as AI. So we might not label it as AI, but in reality, we have some few functionalities that use AI concepts. So this will become really important to develop AI algorithms that are not only powerful and scalable, but also transparent. And I wanted to give an example of a bank application loan process. So let's say we have a system that um, qualify and deny people. So you go in, you give it your information, and using AI it'll compare you with others, discuss your characteristics, look at your profile, credit score, etc., and then either deny you or accept a loan application. Now, if the system is so advanced and has AI capabilities, we might not be able to see how it determined, your outcome. And making sure we have a transparent system gives us that ability. And then the other, important point that I want to mention is that when we design those AI algorithm systems, um, we need to make sure it does not have any external influence or manipulation. Of course, the first thing that comes to mind is the security threats. For example, if you have an AI system used in the government, we want to make sure it does not have any outside interference, uh, and it's safe, to use. Now, let's look at the challenges ensuring that AI operates safely as it approaches a human intelligence. It's a very interesting idea here that I want to explain that is called artificial general intelligence. What do I mean by that? So our current systems for AI are actually domain specific. So we have, a lot of systems that do specific functionalities, and that's why a lot of people currently are not really worried about the ethical, aspects of those designs, because the system does specific things and it's easy to manage and operate. When we get to a point of this concept that is artificial general intelligence, AGI, we're talking about a system that actually can have the same capability and performance of thinking in many different domains, and that's how it complicates things a lot more. So thus the disciplines of AI ethics, for example, especially as it applies to AGI, is likely to differ fundamentally from the ethics discipline of non-cognitive technologies. So for example, when we get to that point where we have AGI, the ethical framework or fundamental concepts of ethical will change compared with our current systems now. So the local specific behavior of AI may not be predictable, given that it works in so many different areas. Now, also verifying the safety of the system becomes a greater challenge, because we must verify what system is trying to do rather than being able to verify the system safe behavior in all operating contexts. Ethical cognition itself must be taken as subject matter of engineering. So now as we design system, we have to think about the ethical aspects of that system as well, because we're giving the system capabilities to think on its own, to compute, to make its own decisions, especially as it gets wider and wider in terms of domain, gets to AGI, we need to make sure it has an ethical framework that it follows. And we'll discuss that in more details in the next slide. Here, this gets us to a very interesting point. That is the main or core point of this whole presentation, is that when we get to, super intelligence or intelligent AI, do they have a moral status? Now, what is a moral status? Francis Cam defines that. So let's say X would have a moral status if X counts morally in its own right. It is impermissible to do things to it for its own sake. So now, like I said, discussed, those are current system. It's kind of like relatively simple AI systems that are currently in use. It's widely agreeable across disciplines that it does not have a moral status, because we can copy, change, terminate, delete all of those softwares. Now, we have to keep in mind that the moral constraints to which we are subject in our dealing with the AI systems are all grounded in our responsibilities to other beings, such as our fellow humans, not in any duties to the system themselves. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that our current understanding or current way of thinking about those systems from a moral point of view, we say, how do those systems affect other humans, and that's how we decide, the ethical approach to those systems. However, when those systems, grow bigger and become more developed and more advanced, now we have to think about the systems themselves, and I'm going to explain a few concepts that are actually, in development right now. It's not really that far in the future that a system would get as intelligent as a human being, and we have to think about its own moral status at that point. Uh, Here I wanted to share a few main definitions that are kind of explain, the status of a being or a machine. Um for example, the first one is a capability to feel pain, and the second one is another way to describe it is actually consciousness or awareness. So if you think about those two, we define a human being as as an ethical being, or that has moral status by mainly those two things. Would they feel pain and suffer, as well as are they aware of their surroundings? So now, uh, the discrimination is based on, when we have two beings that have the same functionalities and the same conscious experience. That's the important part. They have the same conscious experience, and they only differ by their implementation of that experience. And now, then we will say those two have a moral status, the same moral status. So just to repeat, if those two have the same conscious experience, they would have the same moral status. Now, it drives us to the concept of consciousness, and it gets us to this problem. So now, would this, non-sentient person, would it have any moral status whatsoever? And in other words, if we look back at the definition, it means that, would a system that cannot suffer pain, for example, would it have a moral status? Why do we have, or who has this problem? Of course, this community, as we develop those systems. Why should this problem be solved? Because we have a moral obligation, because safety, usefulness of those systems in the future as they develop, and how we're going to solve it. We're going to talk about three different approaches here. So we have a concept of uploading. This is a little bit far in the future, but actually we do have a few publications and a few research in that area itself. So the concept of uploading is actually the ability to scan the brain. To be honest, it's the way they describe it, it's 100% scan of the brain that would emulate the exact same neural networks that a human being would have, and then have it as a software. So of course the first question that comes to mind is it actually plausible, to have that one day? And the second question, ethical question, would be, would that copy, or upload, be the same as the individual who we copied the brain from? And then what happens to the identity if we can copy those uploads multiple times? Would the identity also be copied, or how do we define identity? Of course, if we get to that point, we're going to apply a lot of our mid-level ethical principles to those that govern our current systems for human beings. Now, also, if we get to a point where we can actually upload, an image of the whole brain, we get to the principle of reproductive freedom, which just says, that people have their own right to, have kids and how many kids they have. And then if they can't take care of those kids, the society have a more obligation, or actually by law, to give those, provide the basic needs of those children in the case of parents are not able to do so. Linking that back to the system, then would we have those same principles that we would give the system its own decision making ability, where they would choose if they want to copy themselves or develop more systems? And also, if those systems are not maintainable, would the society be responsible of maintaining those systems? Now, if we even go a little bit more advanced, we get to a concept of an AI that is more intelligent than human beings. That's called superintelligence, which is an AI sufficiently intelligent to understand its own design and could redesign itself or create a successor system more intelligent, which could then redesign itself yet again and become this cycle of systems creating more intelligent systems. We also have the concept of weak superintelligence, which is just exactly like the human mind, but which does things a little bit, or a lot more, much more faster. So it's the same capabilities, just more speed. Or the concept of superintelligence, where it's actually a lot more capabilities, and it can get more intelligence and can produce more systems and can redesign itself. Once we get to that point, we have to know what those systems, what ethical framework those systems are following to be good or evil. Now, let's test this theory. Considering the ethical history of human civilization over centuries of time, we can see that it might prove a very great tragedy to create a mind that was able, in ethical dimensions, along with human civilizations, seem to exhibit the directional change. So what we're talking about here is that, across history and human civilization, we know that our ethical code and ethical moral standards do change over time, and it won't be smart or the right thing to do is to develop AI with our own current framework. Given that this AI can redesign itself and will become smarter than us with way more performance and capabilities, we have to probably have specific standards, but also give that AI itself the capabilities of designing or creating its own ethical pattern. And that's the challenge that a lot of engineers have at this point. So how do we build an AI which, when it executes, become more ethical than you? If we don't really, if we're ourselves not able to define what is more ethical than us, given our own standards, how do we design a system that eventually would get, more ethical than ourselves? We should not try to invent a super version of our own civilization considers to be ethics. So, like I mentioned, we can't really design a system with our current ethical code, given that across history we saw how those change, and once a system becomes more and more intelligence, those ethical principles might not apply, or might get to a point or specific scenarios that are not applicable, or our current code cannot really handle, cannot really give you an answer for. So if machines are to be replaced in a position of being stronger, faster, more trusted, or smarter than humans, then the discipline of machine ethics must commit itself to seek human superior, not just human equivalent, niceness. That's what I mean, given that we're going to give those machines the capability of computing millions and millions of mathematical equations, within minutes, and the capabilities of investigating their own code and rewriting their own code and becoming more intelligent. We have to commit to make sure that ethics is a cornerstone, as well as we have to commit that we seek a human superior ethics. We can even invest in designing systems that tell us how to evolve our own current ethical standard. Here I want to show a quick video. I'm not going to show this whole video, just a few ideas. The reason I want to show this video is to show you the exponential growth in artificial intelligence that we've noticed in the last few years. For example, like I mentioned last time, we did have few systems. We had the system that was won in the chess match against the world champion. We had different systems that define our own ethical code and can challenge us. We had systems that created their own language. So I wanted to kind of show this video because a lot of people, when they look at this presentation, they argue that this is an imaginary idea, or really far in the future, to get to a point where we have a moral status for a machine. But in reality, it's much closer than we think. So let's go ahead and just watch a part of it, and then we'll keep going.
The future of artificial intelligence and ethics on the road to superintelligence. The human brain consists of around 86 billion neurons. It beats the most sophisticated computer in perception, efficiency, and speed, using as little energy as a small 20-watt light bulb. Human or biological evolution is very slow compared to rapid progress of technology. Development of technology. Analyzing the progress of technology over the course of human history, one can see that progress happens in a non-linear fashion, contrary to the common sense, intuitive, linear view. To illustrate this, what would it take for a person to experience an incomprehensible society advancement gap from time era to time era? If a 1750s person time traveled to 2016, what would he classify things? Magical wizard devices, shiny capsule cars, etc.? If someone showed this 1750s person what this magical wizard device, mobile phone, is capable of, touch interface command, maps with blue dots of you on it, able to communicate across the ocean, this 1750s person would think it's utter sorcery, magical and paranormal. Let alone concepts like the space station, the internet, satellites, the Large Hadron Collider, general relativity. Would be incomprehensible to this 1750s person. Furthermore, if a 1500s person came into the 1750s time period, the level of incomprehensibility would be far less in comparison to the 1750s experience of 2016. The 1500s person may be slightly impressed by the Europe fad imperialism and need to relearn his world map model. In fact, to get a similar 1750s shock experience to what he experienced in 2016, a 12,000 BC hunter-gatherer person from post-agriculture to 1750s industrial society would be comparable. Someone in the 1750s explaining to this 12,000 BC hunter-gatherer what cities, massive human empires, ocean-crossing ships, and libraries of knowledge are would be incomprehensible to the hunter-gatherer thinker. Repeating this line of thought process, a 24,000 BC person traveling to the 12,000 BC would notice no difference and couldn't care less. It would take someone from 100,000 BC plus without language, introduced to 12,000 hunter-gatherer society, to get an incomprehensible shock difference. Analyzing this, the incomprehensible shock difference is dropping over time, from 100,000 to 12,000 to a few 100 years. By this post-industrial age, things are moving so fast, it's only a few 100 years. Kurzweil suggests an entire 20th century of progress at the advancement rate of the year 2000 is achieved in 20 years. The rate of progress is 5 times faster in the year 2000. He believes another 20th century's worth of progress occurred between 2000 and 2014, and yet another will happen by 2021. In only a few decades, he believes a 20th century level of progress will occur many times per year, then months, days, etc. The 2030s may be as large of an incomprehensible advancement gap as the person from the 1750s experienced in 2016. It's hard to fathom this, as by nature, people are linear thinkers, not exponential thinkers. Artificial intelligence. Contrary to technology progress, researchers around the development of artificial intelligence tend to think it's a very long ways off into the future, sometimes as much as centuries. Assuming the following scenarios. A. Strong AI is created in 100 years. B. Strong AI is created in 30 years. C. Strong AI is created in 5 years. Now, if humanity were to receive a message from extraterrestrials, hey, fellow humans, we have dispatched an alien mothership, and we are going to arrive somewhere in the next 50 to 100 years. This for sure would be taken a lot more seriously by others, and many further measures will be undertaken as preparations for this future event. While a strong AI has the potential to be a worldwide changing event, a lot of researchers and people aren't taking this as seriously enough. To maximize the chances.
And like I said, this is just to explain how exponential this development process has become lately. And to be honest, from my experience, from what I see, this is artificial intelligence is actually expected to be one of the most advanced technologies that are, for all human existence actually experienced. So, just the concept of thinking about those systems from an ethical standpoint, and start building those frameworks of, what would those systems have an ethical status? If they do, how do we treat it? Also, when those systems start develop their own capabilities, what ethical frameworks are they following? What is considered bad or good, and relative to what? For example, a lot of those systems might understand, the basic arguments of what is wrong to do, and few of the cases where it might be accessible to do, for example, stealing or even lying, white lies, etc. But once those systems become a lot more advanced than us, and they rewrite their code to be a lot more faster, a lot more sufficient, a lot more intelligence, what ethical frameworks are they going to follow, and what do they base their judgment on? Like, would they, for example, say we're always going to define something as ethical or not by its by its implications on other human beings or other machines or other systems or other governments or human existence or animals or even power consumption? Or because, for example, a system would know, even we have current systems now that try to minimize power, minimize memory usage. We have few systems even at Microsoft that we wrote, where we make sure we monitor the memory, and if the memory increase, they do this, that code would use different resources to kind of organize all of that and be as efficient as possible. And a lot of that is actually also in the cloud now. We hear the concept of cloud, but a lot of those systems do that currently, where they look at their resources and see what makes more sense, and they choose that path to reserve power, cost, etc. So given that if those artificial intelligent machine will start redesigning code and do more complicated things and have more authority to do things, control traffic, control banking, finance, even weapons and security threads, and it's just endless. So once those systems get to that point, what is going to be considered an ethical argument or an ethical base that they use to count on? Those are the questions that we kind of have to think about it at this point. And the more advanced, the more intelligent the system would get, then a lot of our current ethical code will not really apply, and might actually fail at a specific point to define what is more ethical to do when a system is way more advanced and have millions and millions of neural networks or decision making trees, and you have all those million decisions to make. It's very easy, given the exponential growth, to get to a point where our ethical code fails and not be able to provide sufficient understanding, because it gets those decisions gets too detailed. They get to a point where they're just too detailed that our ethical current code and standard that we live in as humans might be too general to really define. So the machine would get to a point where both scenarios would give you the same ethical output. And that's what we're talking about here, is that the system itself has to recreate and redefine what is ethical and what is not, and and consider safety, productivity, human impact, and all of that at the same time. So in summary, let's look at what we discussed today. We said current AI offers us few ethical issues because the current AI is not really that developed, but very soon, within a few years, we're going to see huge advancement. And just the fact that current AI offers only few ethical issues does not mean we have to invest some time now to think about the future. So yeah, like I said, current AI offers a few ethical issues that are not already present in the design of cars or power plants. The approach of AI algorithms toward more human-like thought, is that's the one that have complications. Social roles may be filled with AI algorithms, which means we're gonna have AI everywhere, controlling our electricity, computers, life, appointments, even food, delivery. So all of those will imply new design requirements that we have to make sure those systems are transparent, they're predictable, we know their outcomes. Now, AI with sufficient and advanced mental state. Even the concept of mental state kind of changes. We kind of say the right kind of state will have moral status. We have to, it will get to a point where it does have moral status, because it does things for its own good and it makes its own decision. So it does get to it having a moral status. And some might even count as a person. We get to a level where and a machine that has the same maybe, I don't want to say moral status, but I would say the same maybe effects on humanity or society as a human being. I know, for example, in Saudi Arabia, they got one of the AI machines and they gave it a citizenship. So this is it started happening already. So So, like you said, maybe in the very near future, this is unlikely still, but we will get to a point where we have to think about those points. The prospect of AI with superhuman intelligence and superhuman capabilities present us with extraordinary challenges of stating an algorithm that outputs super ethical behaviors. This is a very, very complex problem. we a few options like we discussed. We can give a few simple studies, controlled studies, where we see how those systems evaluate ethical decisions and how they create their own framework. And then based on, we see how as they develop in a controlled environment, we'll see how they start making more ethical decisions. And like we said, we want them to be a superhuman ethical thinkers, not as ethical as us, given that they will be making way more advanced and detailed decisions that we currently humans are capable of. These challenges may seem visionary, but as I showed you in the video, progress is very, very fast, and we actually a lot of people now have even secret projects going on with AI that it's kind of like a race where everybody's jumping on and want to make sure they control it. But even with our current systems, we have some really, really powerful capabilities even in 2019 here, and expecting in a few years with all this investment money and research dedicated, we will expect an explosion of that, and we should not really look at it as a future problem and be faced with it in a few years and not knowing what to do, or change our whole human ethical basis that we build our life on. So again, thank you so much for joining, and I hope you like this concept of of machines and how we apply ethical standards to machines and how we develop them and give them the capabilities to make ethical decisions themselves, and the challenges, a few challenges that we faced and how we define. It gets us back to defining what is a moral status, and how it's comparable to human beings. So thank you so much for joining, and if you have any questions, I'm going to share my contact information right after this.